surface topography of the cerebral hemisphere looks rather confusing, and the pattern of sulci and gyri does vary between different individuals. However, all brains have some basic similarities, and if you start on a drawing, you will quickly realize that the basic pattern is not all that difficult to remember. And it's worth remembering because the clinicians use the main convolutions as a reference system when they talk about cortical functions and cortical lesions. On the basis of some of the major grooves and fissures, the hemisphere is divided into 5 lobes. The frontal lobe occupies the area in front of the central sulcus, here, and above the lateral fissure. The parietal lobe is bounded by the central sulcus in front and by an imaginary line between the parieto-occipital sulcus coming here and the preoccipital notch down here. The temporal lobe is underneath the lateral fissure, and the occipital lobe is located behind the imaginary line between the parieto-occipital sulcus and the preoccipital notch. Insula, the 5th lobe, is located in the bottom of the lateral fissure, and we will see it very nicely when we dissect the brain. Through the presence of 3 main sulci, the precentral sulcus, the superior frontal sulcus, and the inferior frontal sulcus. The frontal lobe is divided into 4 convolutions. Precentral gyrus, which approximately corresponds to the motor cortex, the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus, where Broca's motor speech area is located, usually on the left side. If we were to look at the cerebral cortex with a microscope, we would quickly discover that the histological appearance differs from region to region. And on the basis of these differences, various subdivisions have been identified. The best known of these so-called cytoarchitectural maps is the one published by Brodmann in the beginning of this century. Brodmann identified more than 50 different regions, with the hope, I'm sure, that each one of the regions would eventually be correlated with a specific function. That, of course, makes some sense, because the function of a structure is usually a reflection of its morphology. However, this kind of correlation has been possible only to a certain limited extent, and primarily in regard to the motor and sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. Motor cortex in the precentral gyrus, here, corresponds to Brodmann's area 4, and it is the motor cortex that exercises the voluntary control of movements primarily on the opposite side of the body. Motor cortex is what one might call the specialized cortical center for motor functions, where the different parts of the body are represented not according to their size, but according to their functional significance. The face, including the lips, the tongue and the mouth, important structures for producing speech, have a large representation in the motor cortex, here. And the same is true for the hand area, especially the thumb and the fingers, which are capable of very fine movements. The trunk muscles, here, has a relatively small representation, and the foot is represented on the medial side of the frontal lobe. To talk about cortical centers invites the risk of oversimplification. Many parts of the brain are involved in different aspects of motor functions. And the motor cortex here doesn't exist in isolation here in cerebral cortex. It receives impulses from many other areas of the cerebral cortex and from subcortical structures. And it distributes impulses to many areas of the brain, as well as to the motor centers of the spinal cord. Well, one can look upon it as a distribution center. It's an essential part in a neural circuit and in a series of circuits which are of special importance for motor functions. And if the motor cortex is damaged, the motor functions suffer to a considerable extent. Premotor cortex, area 6, is important for the planning and programming of movement. Merely thinking or performing a movement is reflected by increased neuronal activity in this area. The anterior language area in the inferior frontal gyrus is concerned with motor aspects of speech. It's also called Broca's area, after the French anthropologist and anatomist Paul Broca, who discovered more than 100 years ago that the lesion in this area on the left side had a disastrous effect on a person's ability to speak. It is located in front of the face area, in the motor cortex, which is related to the muscles of the mouth, the tongue, and the pharynx. All important structures for articulation. A patient with a lesion in Broca's area has difficulty speaking, although the muscles of articulations do not necessarily have to be paralyzed. This type of language disorder is referred to as motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia. The large area in the rostral part of the frontal lobe here is referred to as prefrontal cortex. That's the area that is located in front of the premotor cortex. Let me crosshatch the premotor cortex so you see it a little bit better. Well, the term prefrontal cortex isn't altogether appropriate. One really thinks about something ahead of the frontal lobe. Be that as it may, the prefrontal cortex controls many aspects of our personality. Initiative and concentration, foresight and judgment are all dependent on the prefrontal cortex. For instance, a person with a prefrontal lesion may not be able to play chess because he can't think of more than one move at a time. And that may be disastrous if you are a chess player, but the important thing to remember is that the prefrontal cortex is a crucial part of a system that makes it possible for us to perceive the consequences of our actions. And if we can't do that, we might get into all kinds of trouble. Two sulci in the temporal lobe, the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus, divide the lateral surface of the temporal lobe into three gyri: the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. Primary auditory cortex is represented in the superior temporal gyrus at about this level. But most of it is located on the dorsal surface of the gyrus, and it's therefore hidden in the lateral fissure. The primary auditory cortex corresponds to Brodmann's areas 41 and 42, and the area surrounding the primary auditory cortex is also related to auditory functions. The olfactory system is represented in the temporal lobe, but as you may remember, it's located on the medial surface of the temporal lobe. Here, like this, is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and the olfactory cortex is located in the uncus of the parahippocampal gyrus. But what's the importance of the rest of the temporal lobe? Well, it seems to play an important role in memory functions. Many areas of the cerebral cortex are probably involved to a larger or lesser extent in memory functions. But it seems that areas in the medial side of the temporal lobe, in parahippocampal gyrus and in hippocampus, which is a cortical structure that we don't see from the surface. It has sort of rolled into the lateral ventricle in order to accommodate itself. Look here. Parahippocampal gyrus, on this cross-section. Here is parahippocampal gyrus and hippocampus facing the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. The parahippocampal gyrus and the hippocampus ultimately receive fiber pathways from many areas of the cerebral cortex. And it has recently been shown that structures here in the parahippocampal gyrus are damaged in patients with Alzheimer's disease or presenile dementia. Alzheimer's patients suffer from mental deterioration and especially from failing memory. Well, other parts of the brain may also be damaged in Alzheimer's patients. One is basal nucleus of Minot. That is a nucleus that is located on the base of the brain in this general region, but a little bit further forward underneath the anterior perforated space. The parahippocampal gyrus here and other areas in the surrounding region are of importance for face recognition. You know, the recognition of faces is an important talent, and it seems that quite a large area in this general region of parahippocampal gyrus, further back towards the occipital lobe, are of importance for face recognition. In the parietal lobe, a post-central sulcus here delineates the caudal border of the post-central gyrus, in which the somatosensory cortex is located. Somatosensory cortex, which is of importance for the analysis of somatic sensation. It is represented by Brodmann's areas 1, 2, and 3. The intraparietal sulcus separates the rest of the parietal lobe into superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule, in which two very important gyri are located. The supramarginal gyrus, here at the tip of the lateral fissure, that's area 40, and the angular gyrus here, which caps the posterior part of the superior temporal sulcus, that's area 39. The area of these two gyri plus the surrounding cortex are important for the understanding and comprehension of written and spoken language. And it's referred to as the posterior language area. Like this. The more posterior parts of this area, in the region of the angular gyrus, bordering here on the occipital lobe, are important for recognizing the visual forms of words, whereas the more anterior parts, here, close to the auditory cortex, are important for recognizing the spoken words. This more anterior part of the language area, in the superior temporal gyrus, is really the part referred to as Wernicke's area, after a Polish neurologist who just about 100 years ago recognized the presence of an auditory speech area or auditory association area for the understanding of the spoken language. The two language areas, Broca's area and the sensory language area, are closely interrelated by a massive association bundle, the arcuate fasciculus. But it's also important to remember that these two language areas are closely related to many other parts of the cerebral cortex. And it's quite likely that many as yet unidentified parts of the hemisphere are responsible for certain aspects of complex language functions. The occipital lobe is primarily related to visual function. The primary visual cortex, area 17, is located in the area of the calcarine fissure, most of which is located here on the medial side of the hemisphere. This area is important for the perception and recognition of visual stimuli. The other parts of the occipital lobe, areas 18 and 19, are also related to visual functions of increasingly more complicated nature, such as color vision and perception of depth and movements. We'll now go to the specimen and identify the different lobes and the sulci and the gyri. Here we have cleaned the specimen very well, taken away the pia arachnoid, and now we'll use watercolors and identify the different sulci. Here in the middle is the central sulcus. Here, of course, is the lateral fissure coming up. The parieto-occipital sulcus is seen on the medial side, but it's about here, and an imaginary line down towards the preoccipital notch, like this. Now we can identify the four lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. In the frontal lobe, here is the precentral sulcus. Here is the superior frontal sulcus here, and the inferior frontal sulcus over here, which will divide the frontal lobe into the precentral gyrus, the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus, with Broca's speech area in this region. Well, let's go to the parietal lobe. Here is the postcentral sulcus, just about here, and the intraparietal sulcus, just about here. So here we have then the postcentral gyrus, the superior parietal lobule here, and the inferior parietal lobule, with the supramarginal gyrus here that caps the lateral fissure, the posterior part of the lateral fissure, and the angular gyrus here, which caps the posterior part of the superior temporal sulcus. So here, in the temporal lobe, we have the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus here, which then gives us the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. Let's then look at the medial side of the hemisphere like this. Here it is. And now, here is the cingulate sulcus like this, and the cingulate gyrus all the way along continues here into the parahippocampal gyrus. Excuse me, here, get the better. Here, the parahippocampal gyrus with this hook-shaped part, the uncus of the parahippocampal gyrus. Well, on the medial side too, we can see very nicely the calcarine fissure, this level, comes together here with the parieto-occipital sulcus, this level, like that. Now, these structures between the calcarine fissure and the parieto-occipital sulcus is referred to the cuneus, the wedge-shaped area, and in front of the parieto-occipital sulcus is the precuneus. Here is the extension of the central sulcus coming to the medial side, like this. So this area then is referred to as the paracentral lobule. And that is where we have the foot representation in the cortex. Well, let's look a little bit on the inferior surface here. Here you can see this is here the collateral sulcus like this, which then separates the parahippocampal gyrus from the fusiform gyrus on this inferior surface. And in this general region of the parahippocampal gyrus, part of the fusiform gyrus, where we have the face recognition center. Although the two hemispheres seem to be symmetrical, that's not necessarily true for all parts of the hemisphere. As you know, many highly specialized functions are lateralized to one hemisphere or the other, language being the most prominent example.